And we've talked a lot about this as this has been such a time of incredible change, and we want to look at the positive aspects of change. Last week we had our first Lenten Conversation. We talked about courage for the C in change. This week is H, and our word is humility. Humility is a really interesting word. It is a virtue, right? But there is what I would call the shadow side of humility, which you called the dark side this morning when we talked earlier. And that's this idea that somehow we are not supposed to toot our own horn or be prideful. And I think that it can often have the impact of our being less of ourselves than we're able to be, that we can become self-conscious or less in ourselves. I think it's particularly true of women who are not ever supposed to, how am I thinking about
call attention to yourself,
you're supposed
or to stand out.
To stand out, and I think of Gene Weber, who used to say, you never want to be the tallest sunflower in the field, right? And I think that's a shame because it keeps us from fully living into who we are called to be and who we are meant to be. And I think there's a real negative side to that I'd love to hear your input on. But before we get there, that's not what I see in the biblical idea of humility, right? We think of Jesus as the ultimate model of sort of this humble being. Yet Jesus he wasn't bashful. He didn't hide who he was. He was authentically himself and went out into the world being this authentic, often confident being, and yet didn't think twice about sitting down and having a meal with prostitutes and tax collectors. There was never this sense of, I am better than you, or I know better. He was preaching this incredible word through these stories and sharing these stories with us, but it was never, you're wrong and I'm right? There was this humility to Jesus that allowed him to be fully and authentically himself. And I think if we think of humility in that sense, it can be very empowering. And so as I have been thinking about this throughout the week, I kept going back to the scripture over this past Sunday. And when we picked these words, we didn't intentionally look at the scripture and say, let's find words that fit in. But to me, the scripture this past Sunday, which was where Jesus is telling his followers, if you want to follow me, deny yourself and carry your cross. And I used that as an example last week of real courage, carrying your cross. And it's got me thinking, though, over this past week, it's this beautiful place where that courage and that humility come together. So what does it mean to deny yourself, and what courage it takes to, and confidence to go out into the world in that way? And how do you deny yourself and yet be authentically yourself? This seems like this conundrum, but they came together in this beautiful way in that scripture. So that's what I've been thinking a lot about, the courage, something I'd never thought of before, the courage that it takes to be truly humble in the world. So I'm curious what your thoughts are, both on that shadow and that dark side, but how you see humility and how you define that for yourself, and the courage that it requires to sometimes deny yourself. Philippians 2 defines humility as putting others before yourself, which is often an act of courage as well. So to hear your thoughts on.
Well, my first thought as I was listening to you is I agree that courage and humility are not very far apart in my mind, right? I think that to have courage, like we were talking framed as we were talking about it last week, is very close to having humility, and because if we can define humility, and it's a word that is used kind of carelessly, I think, because for many it evokes this sort of, I don't know, shrinking quality, right?
Exactly.
Making ourselves small.
Yeah, and it's
Yes.
not that.
Yeah.
And it's
Right.
not that. Well, it is if our tendency is to be overly large, then perhaps it is backing off on that a little bit. If our tendency is to shrink, then maybe true humility means to be a little larger, right? And both of those moves take some courage, I think. I like to go back to the sort of the definition of humility that speaks most to me is to strive to become right-sized.
Yeah, you said that earlier today.
Yeah,
It was like, ooh, I like that.
I like that too.
in whatever situation we find ourselves, and that right size might change from situation to situation for us. If we're a parent at home, our right size may be a little bit larger than what we would like to have to do. And if it's in the public sphere, sometimes it might be a little smaller. But then it goes back to being genuine, right?
I like how both of you are connecting in your own way humility with authenticity, really living into our truest self. One of the things that, and this is not a direct paraphrase from the writings of John Ortberg, but this idea of that there's a part of the development of the spiritual life or the virtuous life or the life of faith embodied, where we, I think there's this notion of becoming more you than you ever imagined yourself being. And that for me is like really having those moments in life. And of course, it all goes like this. And so much of humility has to do with balance. But that idea of really threading the needle to our authenticity, like our God-given, God-made giftedness alongside our experience, both our successes and our failures and everything in between that makes us, a unique tile within the mosaic or our own puzzle piece in the puzzle. But I'm really taken with this as we've been chatting about humility, about this, how it's so given to balance, not enough humility lends itself to pride, an overemphasis on our own needs or our own purposes. Too much humility gives over to withdrawal and becoming small and not exercising our voice or our heart or our giftedness, which denies the mosaic, the beautiful piece, or the puzzle, the piece that fits just right there. So it's tricky in developing a practice for humility, because it's like, well, don't go over there. Well, no, don't go over there either.
Right. Well, and again, I think that's why the model of Jesus is such a good one, because he was very authentically self.
Yeah.
And I made the comment earlier today about his going out in confidence, and yes, with not to say that he didn't have self-doubt, that we all have, but confidently being himself, like not trying to bluster his way through and say, I know the answer.
Right.
Y'all better listen because I've got it. But speaking his truth in ways that could be heard that didn't belittle the other people around him. And I think that sense of authenticity is a hard balance. But if we all came in here and said, you're right and I'm wrong. No, you're wrong and I'm right, is what I really, that doesn't allow me to be my authentic self or allow you to be your authentic self, and it doesn't create an opportunity for us to learn and grow and engage together in a healthy way. And so finding that balance is really a critical piece. And we're in a culture that doesn't nurture that often.
Yeah.
It nurtures one extreme or the other, but that balance is not as much.
I feel like what I hear oftentimes is this idea of, well, you just do you, and then if everyone does that, it'll work out.
Right.
And I'm like, that's not how it works. I mean, because we all do ourselves to a different degree at different times.
Right.
And I love holding humility up as a value, especially during a time where we find ourselves polarized or times of conflict, or not just times of conflict, but times of transition. When there's a lot of change or a lot of stress, I think that practice can help bring us back down. That idea of, I've really been focusing in 2021 in my own personal practice on being grounded and serene. And I think that humility gives rise to both groundedness and serenity. Groundedness, thinking like, okay, I'm feeling pretty comfortable on my feet with who I am, and pretty sure I'm exercising out of my authentic self. Serene in the sense of calm in the midst of chaos, and I think humility, a practice of humility, helps us remain connected one to another, particularly in times of disconnection or struggle.
So what does a practice of humility really look like? What are the aspects of that?
The thing that comes to mind for me most quickly is like giving credit, where we're all in a cooperative environment here. I'm super sensitive to this because for almost everything that goes right at St. John's, I get credit. And it's not fair. It's just because of the title and the position where I'm like, no, that was Brian's idea. Or wait, that was Robin's idea. Or,
And thankfully for us, for everything that goes wrong, you get blamed.
Yeah.
I do get some of that. But I think it's so important in our culture right now for us to get to give credit. As I was doing a little research on humility, I saw I was picking out some pieces of writing that used humility, and I saw there was a quotation by a popular evangelical pastor, humility is XYZ, and then later on in my discovery, I saw it was a C.S. Lewis quote, but it was attributed to this person, and most likely it was a mistake,
Sure.
but I think we have to be careful about that, and the practice of taking our light and letting others shine, I think is important. Not too much. We don't want to dim our light so that others do, but we want to share it.
Right.
I love what you said about humility having a couple different components, one of which was groundedness, because as I was doing my research on humility, I came to something that I kind of had vaguely remembered. The root word for humility is humus, which is ground, which is earth, right? And so, what could be both more powerful and more humble than simple earth, right? And I think that if we can come back into ourselves, and we talk a lot about our true selves, and I think at some point that would be a basis for a great conversation too. But that to come back to ourselves is to come back to the earth, come back to these very simple things. And so what I've been trying to do to help with my practice of humility is to say you're welcome when somebody says thank you.
Yeah, that's great.
I don't normally do that. If you say thank you to me, I'll probably say, oh, no problem, or sure, or
worries.
something like that, which sort of minimizes, in a way, negates the thanks that you have just given to me.
Right.
Right? So to be more responsive, I think, is a great way to practice humility.
Yeah. Which bolsters that human connection.
Right.
Right.
It builds relationship.
Well, I think that's true of the thanks, but also of the giving credit. You're very good at this. You are too. I mean, both of you, after a Sunday morning, there's this exchange that happens like, great sermon, Jimmy, or, and to just accept that and say, gosh, thank you.
Yeah.
That's really important. It's important to give the credit and to accept the credit and say, oh, that feels good. Thank you for saying that.
That's back to that balance.
Yes, and you went like this when you said balance, right? And,
And
I
it's
mean,
not,
it's
that
not
stiff upright.
It's
It's
not
that
rigid.
driving down the highway, those constant micro adjustments that we're
Right.
making.
yeah. And once again, I mean, we make all of our adjustments in relationship to gravity, and I'm going right back to the earth again
Yep.
there,
The
right?
grounding.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And I think that one of the things that almost makes humility a little difficult to talk about, and you alluded to it, Mary, is that we live in a culture that, when was the last time in our culture that you heard humility held up as a virtue?
Yeah.
Right.
Rarely, if ever.
We live in an age of celebrity.
Celebrity and
self-promotion.
self-actualization, the you do you.
Yeah.
In this sense that humility is really about that interaction, the I'm going to put your needs at this moment before my own, right? It's not all about me and what I need or what I believe. And I think that's in this culture that we live in that is so divided. It is because I am going to stick in my place and you're going to stay in yours, and that is not a position of humility. That is that stubborn, like, I'm right. Now, that doesn't get us anywhere. That doesn't move the conversation forward. And so if I can say, here's where I am, but I hear where you are too. I get that. That is a sense, a form of humility, of not having to be right.
There's humility for me in keeping my mouth shut and opening my ears at times. I mean, there are times when we must speak, no question about that. And to not speak at those times is not a sign of humility.
Right.
Yeah.
Right? But listening and being open to views and opinions and people that I might violently disagree with,
Sure.
but to actually be willing to listen and to try to hear what is being said.
And just to value the relationship over agreement.
Yeah.
Right.
Right? And we all draw certain boundaries, like, hey, I don't want to hear the racism. I don't want to hear the homophobia. I don't, we draw all those healthy boundaries. It's part of the balancing act of it. But we also don't insist upon like-mindedness.
Right.
Because like-mindedness is, I don't even aspire to like-mindedness.
Right.
No.
It's not
Be
aspirational.
boring, wouldn't it?
Yeah,
It would be
it's not.
boring.
The uneven topography of opinion is so central for me to what happens here or what
Absolutely.
happens at the table.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I feel like Jesus was utterly comfortable in that diversity of opinion. There were the issues that he drew his boundaries around. He gets pretty mad this week.
Yes, he does.
We get that turning of the temple.
Yeah. But he also, I think we talked about this last week, that he doesn't feel the need to defend his position, really. When somebody says, you are this, and he says,
You
You,
say
you
so.
say so. That is, that takes confidence, that takes courage, and it is humble. It is, okay, that's all right. I don't need to constantly be defending myself.
Right.
And that's hard, I think. I think that's hard for us to just, that's all right.
So we talked a little bit earlier, and I just don't want this conversation to end without each of us having a chance to respond to this. But
Okay.
like, how important is humility now? Then, so important.
So important. And I think you're right. Culturally, it is not a value in our current culture. It's so important, though.
Yeah, I'm scratching my head and trying to think of, and of course, all these things are interconnected. So when we put one above the other, it's hard,
Yep.
or it's not as defined as
Right.
a list might seem.
Right.
But golly, I just feel like humility is so important these days.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm agreeing with you, and so lacking.
Right.
I mean, I hate to say that, but it's what I view from both sides. I mean, if not having humility means either blowing your own ego and your own wants and needs out of proportion, we see that, and we also see, and mostly in our interpersonal connections, I think, we know people who take it to the exact opposite extreme. And it's hard to say that is not being humble or having humility, but there sort of is a little bit of an aspect of that in being overly humble,
Right.
right?
I was saying earlier this morning that my husband has always said that humility is his most core value. He thinks that's the most important thing.
Yeah.
And I get frustrated with it because I feel like he's not willing to admit his gifts. And the more we've talked about it today and the more I've thought about it after 21 years of marriage, I realize, no, he's just so comfortable in his gifts. It's not that he doesn't recognize them or know that they're there. He's just so comfortable in them.
Yep.
He doesn't need to hold them up and say, look how good I am at this.
Yeah.
So it's actually a really nice balance of humility, but it's very different from certainly how I was raised. And so it's taken me a while to understand, oh, that is a really lovely virtue and a
Yeah.
really important virtue.
Yeah, and listening to you, I'm thinking maybe a measure of humility arrives with integration. So maybe it's not that humility is an aspect of authenticity, but when we are authentic or when we are integrated, however you want to say it,
Yeah.
it just sprouts
Yeah.
in a certain
Kind of
way.
emerges
Yeah.
from that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Anything else?
What are we talking about next week?
You're on next
next
week. It's an interesting one.
Hey,
We're talking about angels and wild beasts.
I love it.
I do too. That'll be fun. Good. Well, thank you all for tuning in. Have a wonderful week. We'll see you here same time next week and hopefully on Sunday. I'm really excited. We're going to be welcoming many of you back into the church this Sunday. I hope you can join us. If not, that you'll join us virtually. Thanks, guys. This was good.
Keep the change.
Keep the
Bye.
change.